Coming to you from Toronto, Canada, this is MENSCHlife TV, and I'm Doris Epstein. Today I've got two fascinating people, both of whom are outstanding in their fields, and not just outstanding, but innovators. First of all, Dr. Gideon Cohen, welcome.
Thank you.
Out of your busy schedule, I'm really, really pleased to meet you and hear about the amazing thing that you've done about bringing in 2002, a minimally invasive technique in cardiac surgery. Can you tell us about it? It's called the Maes technique?
Yes. First of all, let me start by saying that I'm pleased and thrilled to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. In 2002, I actually did I did most of my training here at the University of Toronto in the Division of Surgery, or Department of Surgery. I completed my residency here in 1999, and then went to the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio, to complete a fellowship in, amongst other things, minimally invasive heart surgery. One of the procedures that I brought back from Cleveland was a new procedure which is designed to eliminate an irregular heartbeat that plagues millions of Canadians and Americans and people worldwide, actually.
Well, what were they doing with it before? How to correct it?
Beforehand, we were treating it primarily with medications. Most people, the rhythm was just controlled with what we called rate control therapy, where we wouldn't eliminate the abnormal rhythm, but we would control how fast their heartbeat was going. And there were some new procedures which involved catheters which were inserted to the heart through an artery in the groin, which attempted to eliminate this irregular heartbeat, but at the time, these were not very successful. And because of that, we didn't have much in the way of options, and most people just learned or had to learn how to live with this irregular heartbeat. And unfortunately, this abnormality predisposes to stroke, predisposes to heart failure, and can cause death.
I thought there was an implant that corrected irregular heartbeat.
No, implants don't correct them. Implants can control them. So there are new implants. If you do develop a potentially fatal arrhythmia or irregular heartbeat, we do have implants now called automatic implantable cardiac defibrillators, or ICDs, which are like pacemakers which sit under the skin and which detect when the heart reverts into these abnormal heart rhythms, and then can shock the heart to try and get the heart back into a normal rhythm. But for this procedure that was introduced in 2002, it was designed to treat an irregular heart rhythm known as atrial fibrillation. And that's a rhythm which can come on at any time. Sometimes it's induced by activity, sometimes by certain diets, caffeine-rich diets, and certain times with no predisposing features at all. It certainly tends to increase in its rate the older you get, but also can be as an accompaniment to another number of different cardiac abnormalities, valve problems, other heart diseases.
What are the symptoms? What do people feel?
Well, sometimes people don't notice anything. So a lot of people actually are in atrial fibrillation and they're unaware of it. But more often people feel that the heart is racing. They complain of a sensation such as the heart trying to beat out of their chest, almost. It can be quite uncomfortable in terms of the palpitations, but it can also cause chest tightness, it can cause shortness of breath, it can cause lightheadedness, and in the most severe forms it can predispose to strokes.
And yet, not everybody feels that racing heart. So how is it picked up?
So in those individuals who are asymptomatic, it's usually picked up just through an incidental finding and a routine physical examination at their family doctor's office. It's simple to pick up just by palpating or feeling someone's pulse at their wrist. Sometimes it's picked up through a routine annual exam where your physician may perform an EKG, and then sometimes due to an hospitalization for another reason, they may pick it up as well.
You can be asymptomatic with a heart attack as well, can't you?
That's correct, yes. Those are called silent heart attacks, and certain individuals, especially diabetics, sometimes lose the capacity for sensation. And you've heard it in diabetics when they lose some of the sensation in their peripheries because of the impact of the diabetes on the nervous system. The same thing can happen with the heart as well, where some people just don't have the capacity to sense the pain that sometimes would accompany a heart attack.
Then again, how do you know you should take yourself to the hospital?
Good question. Often you don't know, and very often people mistake a heart attack for a flu-like illness. They think it's a flu-like illness, and in fact they're having a heart attack. Once again, many of these patients are picked up because now we have very aggressive screening protocols. So people that are high risk for heart attacks, even if they are asymptomatic, we recommend certain screening, blood work to assess.
So diabetics are high risk?
Yes, diabetics are high risk. Smokers, obviously, obese individuals, individuals with high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and especially individuals with a strong family history of heart disease are obviously at risk. So those people are picked up earlier. Even if they are asymptomatic, we recommend screening of those individuals through various high-risk clinics throughout the city, whereby they can be put through a series of tests, including stress tests, to try and pick up heart disease which may otherwise not be known.
Should we be tested regularly for heart disease, for potential heart attacks, and at what age does the risk increase?
Well, I think it depends on your risk factors and specifically on your family history. So I think if you have a family history of heart disease, then I don't think it's unreasonable to start being tested in your 40s. Sometimes even sooner, if somebody has a history in their family, specifically a history of premature heart disease, in other words, a father who had a heart attack at the age of 40, then perhaps you should be screened earlier. Every individual is taken to light separately, and I think that you have to treat each case by itself. But I think that for the most part, we recommend screening by the age of 50 in terms of a routine stress test, which can be performed through your family doctor's office. Obviously, blood testing, cholesterol, blood pressure, those are very simple things to test and can mitigate a lot of the risks.
What can we do to have a healthy heart? It's all over heart healthy diets, heart healthy exercise, heart healthy, but what do you, with your experience, what do you recommend?
Well, healthy living, obviously. I mean, there are certain things you can change and certain things you can't change. You can't change your parents, unfortunately. So genetics is obviously an important part, and if you happen to have genetics as part of your risk, then you can't change that, so you have to really concentrate on changing the things that you can change. So,
vegetarianism?
Well, no, not necessarily vegetarianism, but diet is crucial. So low salt, no added fat diet, or low fat diet, high fiber diet, lots of vegetables, lots of fruits, all those things are very, very important. And we all know that. Whether
we
or
all
not
know stuff like that.
we all know that's important. What don't we know? We probably underestimate the impact of exercise on maintaining heart health. We know that it's important, but I think we don't know how important it is. And I can tell you that it's extremely important, no question about it. A regular exercise program is crucial to maintaining heart health, and I will tell you that I'd say 90% of my patients are not involved in an exercise program. We hope that many of them after their heart surgery will become involved, and to that end we enroll all of our patients in an outpatient cardiac rehabilitation program, which
But how rigorous do you have to be to exercise? Do you have to run to a gym? Is walking enough?
Well, obviously it depends on your abilities, it depends on your age, but you have to achieve some element of cardiovascular fitness through your exercise regimen. So in other words, it's not good enough to walk a block if your heart rate's not going up, if you're not feeling some element of fatigue from that.
Oh, so that's the criteria. You have to feel...
Well, you have to get your heart rate up, is what the key is.
And can you feel that happening?
You should be able. If you can't, then you can get very simple heart rate monitors. You can get these watches that will You can just press a button on the watch and it'll give you your heart rate. You can get monitors that you can wear across the chest. You can feel your pulse very simply. That's a simple thing to do. But you have to, there has to be some element of exertion. You know, a lot of people will tell me in my office, I ask them if they're in an exercise program, they'll tell me they're not, but they're very active at their job and they have to walk from here to there and go up a flight of stairs. Well, you know, it just simply doesn't cut it. It's not enough because it has to be sustained exercise for a period of time. I would say at least half an hour a day, at least, if not an hour a day. And there are different guidelines depending who you believe in, obviously the cardiac rehabilitation programs that we enroll our patients in are very good at guiding individuals. And there's no question that those programs have actually been shown to promote longevity. People that go through these cardiac rehab programs actually live longer than they would otherwise.
But the basic principle is exert yourself so that you're doing, you feel that you're doing more, and you can get all these devices to
yes,
prove
you can, absolutely. And obviously it depends, as I mentioned before, it depends on the individual. Some people simply can't exert themselves. Maybe they have back problems or hip problems and they can't walk, but there's other things they can do. They can do aerobics in the water. You know, there's bicycle ergometrics where they can actually use their arms on a bicycle type of device to increase their heart rate. There's all kinds of things you can do, despite the fact that you may have limitations.
So there's no excuses.
There's no excuses, and it's never too late to start. But you certainly want to start before you begin to develop disabilities, which you may not be able to get over.
After finishing a surgical residency, you did something more. You took a master's degree and a PhD in microbiology.
Actually, molecular biology.
Molecular biology.
Yes.
That was, how long would you go to school until then? Up until that point, how many years in university?
I try not to think about it. Well, my undergraduate training was 3 years at the University of Toronto.
Okay.
And then 4 years in
medical school, surgical.
And a year of internship. And then it was about 9 years of residency training.
And after all that, you go for a PhD in molecular biology?
Well, the PhD was actually part of that. So because the University of Toronto is a very strong academic institution, and because the Department of Surgery at the University of Toronto really holds academics in very high regard, we really encourage our trainees, and at the time I was encouraged to pursue a degree so you can become not just a clinician but also an academic. And we continue to promote that.
But how does that help you as a surgeon, as a cardiac surgeon?
That's a great question.
Why did you do it?
Well, because I think it's the right thing to do. Obviously, I was part of a program which promoted it. I'm currently the program director, so I'm in charge of the residency training program at the University of Toronto for the cardiac surgical residency program. And you know, we choose residents who we think are going to be not only strong clinicians and strong surgeons, but also strong academics. And the reason is because, you know, obviously we give back to the community based on the operations we perform, but you also have to give back based on new knowledge, new technology, innovation, and that's very important. It also gives you a way of keeping up with what's new. A well-read surgeon, there's nothing better than a well-read and a well-informed surgeon.
But why molecular biology? Why not Shakespeare?
Well, that's a good question.
Or
at the time,
Yehoshua?
Yes. There's a lot of different areas you can pursue as part of your research years. You can pursue clinical epidemiology, you can pursue teaching, you can pursue molecular biology or basic science. I chose it at the time because it seemed to be an area that was a growth area at the time in cardiac surgery. There were a lot of unanswered questions when it came to how do we best protect the heart during heart surgery and during transplantation. And this was a cell model that I thought was very enticing and that I wanted to develop further. So I spent some time in the lab, and I had never done any basic science research before then, so this was quite eye-opening and quite an experience for me. I have to admit that once I achieved my PhD, I did pursue it for some time, but I haven't pursued it in my professional life because I've gone on to more clinical research, clinical epidemiology, where I study my patients and do numerous studies involving procedures in the operating room, follow-up of patients, seeing what works, what doesn't work, and so on and so forth.
And what have you learned from that? What works? What doesn't work?
Well, we've learned a lot of things. You know, the field of cardiac surgery and medicine as a whole is a very rapidly evolving field. And if you don't follow your patients, and if you don't have a good database and a good statistician to ensure that you're collecting the data properly, and that you're following patients, and you have 100% follow-up, then you're really missing out on a lot of very valuable information. So, for instance, there was a valve which was developed in Toronto back in the early 90s, which at the time we felt was probably the best thing next to sliced bread. You know, it was the valve of the future.
It was a pig valve?
It was a pig valve, that's correct. And
is that kosher, by the way?
Is
it okay for Jews to have pig valves?
The pigs are circumcised, yes. No, yes, it is kosher. Not a kosher pig, but it's okay for Jews to have pig valves. Yeah, so we thought that this valve would be really the next best thing, and so what we did is we conducted a trial where we randomized patients to receive the conventional valve versus this new valve. And it turns out that this valve wasn't any better than the conventional valve, and in fact tended to deteriorate sooner than the conventional valve. So this was something important for us to know, and because of that, the valve has since been taken off the market, and we're not using it anymore. So, and if we hadn't followed those patients, if we hadn't performed that study, then we wouldn't have known that.
Does that extend to the field of surgery in general? Hip replacement?
Sure.
Is there follow-through in research
absolutely.
on that?
Absolutely.
On everything?
On everything.
Because otherwise, how do you know what works and what doesn't? In everything.
Right. And we have a very strong regulatory board here in Canada in terms of Health Canada, and every new procedure, every product is placed through really stringent requirements and prerequisites before it's actually accepted into clinical practice.
Is that good, or is that a little paralyzing? Till they go through that, when you get something hot and something new, even if it's been proven in the United States, how long did it take you to get that procedure, the Maes, accepted here?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question.
When they were doing it for 10 years in Cleveland, weren't they?
Well, probably
Something
in Europe
like
before then. They were doing it for a while in Cleveland, but there are a number of issues, and that's an excellent question because, for instance, now we have a number of new procedures which allow us to, just as an example, procedures known as percutaneous valve technology, which allow us now to replace heart valves and repair heart valves without having to open the chest. So basically we can do this through catheters in the groin.
That's unbelievable. Under
X-ray guidance. It truly is unbelievable, and it's now allowing us to offer valve replacement to patients who in the past would not have been candidates and had no other option but to unfortunately go home and eventually die from their disease. So for instance, this new device, new procedure, is currently still considered experimental and is approved by Health Canada only on special access. In other words, not every patient is a candidate because it's an unproven technology. It works very well, but we don't have any long-term data. We don't know how long the valve will last. Having said that, there are patients who, if they didn't have this procedure, they would die within a year. So now we have patients that are fortunately candidates for this procedure. But it's a procedure which is not approved for every patient that we implant the device, and we have to receive an approval from Health Canada. And in addition to that,
that's a drag. That's another waiting period.
It is a waiting period, but also probably one of the biggest problems is funding. So because it's not an approved device, there's no funding by the Ministry of Health. So the devices, which run anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 a device, have to be funded by the individual institution. So in my case, Sunnybrook Foundation, which raises money for the institution, has to go out and solicit funds from donors.
Or people pay themselves?
No, people cannot pay themselves. They can make a donation to the foundation, but they can't pay for their own valve. so we're dependent on those donations in order to perform the procedure. How long will it take for this device to eventually be approved? It'll take years. So, in some ways it's good because we ensure that only the safest, most proven devices eventually reach the market and are implanted in our patients. But on the other hand, it is possibly costly in terms of patients who may not receive this device because of costs or inavailability or just the fact that we don't have it in time for them.
We'll be back in a minute after this break, so stay with us. We're back with Dr. Gideon Cohen, cardiac surgeon, and the whole idea of surgeon surgery. In 50 years, will you be obsolete, what you're doing now?
I hope not, although I hope to be retired by 50 years from now. So, but there's no question that the face of surgery is changing. We are using more and more minimally invasive techniques to perform our procedures. For instance, in the past, where the only option was to perform an operation through an incision in the middle of the chest with a very long scar, now we can perform similar operations through small 5-centimeter incisions on the side of the chest, using telescopic instruments, and the procedure, instead of being performed with direct visualization, is actually performed with the help of a camera on a video monitor. So that's definitely changed. In addition to that, as I mentioned before, we have these new percutaneous valve techniques which allow us to replace and repair valves through catheters which are placed in arteries in the groin and tracked up to the heart under X-ray guidance. And in those cases, the procedure can often be done in the awake patient. Patients can go home a day or two after the procedure. There's no question that things are changing. I don't think surgeons will ever be obsolete, but so long as we change with the times. And there's no question that I have had to retrain myself in these new procedures. For the minimally invasive procedures, I had to learn how to use new instruments, very long telescopic instruments, because I wasn't able to can't get your hand into the chest through a very small incision. You have to work from outside of the chest. I've had to get used to viewing the operation on a video monitor rather directly with my own eyes, and obviously that's changed.
It's very difficult.
It's very difficult, and that's why there's been a lot of commentary about the benefit of video games and this younger population nowadays, that may help them with procedures such as the ones we're performing in the operating theater now. So that's important. Also, for the catheter-based procedures, during my training, I didn't set foot in a cath lab. That was something that was really the territory of the cardiologists who performed the angiograms and angioplasties. But because of these new catheter-based valves, now I've had to not train myself, but seek training in catheter-based techniques. So that's changed as well.
That's hard on you.
Yeah, it is hard.
Constantly,
Yeah.
There's so many things coming that are new, and dramatically new, as well as the toll emotionally and physically on what you do. Of all the things, of all the medical specialties you could have gone into, why something so demanding, so emotionally fraught with threats of death, possibilities of death? Was there a particular reason you chose this field?
Yeah, I think that I always knew I wanted to be a surgeon. I didn't know at the beginning that I wanted to be a heart surgeon. I knew I wanted to be a surgeon, and during my training I rotated through all the different surgical subspecialties, plastic surgery, orthopedic surgery, you name it. And at the time I loved everything, But cardiac surgery really was a subspecialty that really I was most attracted to. And I think because of the impact it has on patients, because of the immediate gratification that you get. I mean,
but you yourself have called it, it's a field which is life and death, life and death surgery.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, there's no question that every time you operate on a patient, you're holding their life in your hands. But you can't think about it that way, because you have a job to do, and you go in and do it. And if you get too emotionally involved at the time of the surgery, then it interferes with your ability to do the job properly. So I've said this before. We're glorified mechanics. We go in to fix something, and We have to be very good at what we do, but and there's no question that at times things become very stressful. There's no question. And we are reminded of that constantly. For
Was
the
that
most
part
part,
of your training, how to deal with loss of life, how to deal?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you never get used to that. You know, but you can't forget because for the most part, you know, 90% of the operations go very smoothly. But there are certain operations which don't go as planned, and there are unforeseen circumstances. And sometimes, you know, you'll be operating and you're not sure you're going to be able to get the patient off the table, and you're already thinking in your mind about what kind of conversation you're going to be having with the family who's waiting out in the waiting room, and there's no easy way of doing that, and you have to block that out of your mind and do the best job you can, and that comes with experience, it comes with time. But I can't say that it gets any easier. I mean, you know, as a cardiac surgeon, unfortunately, you have to get used to losing patients because that's the nature of the business.
Do you ever get used to it?
No, you don't. You don't. You don't get used to it. But you have to accept that as part of the profession. And when it does happen, you know, you take it home with you. You can't not take it home with you. You know, I mean, my wife will tell you that she knows when I've had a bad day at work, because I don't only come home and I'm you know, depressed for that evening. I'm depressed for, you know, a week after that. You know, so it does, and it's part of being a human being. You know, you just cannot completely separate yourself from the emotional toll, especially when you have to deal with families who are grieving over the loss of a loved one, and you can't help but place yourself in their position. But I think it's
trained to tell people when someone in the family, their family has died, when your patient, are you trained for that kind of presentation, to that kind of talk?
Yeah, I think we do a much better job of training our residents and medical students now in dealing
well, you're training residents.
Yes, yes.
And is that part of what you do?
Absolutely, absolutely. But and we're doing a much better job now than we did, for instance, when I was a medical student. But you know, there really is no good way of training something like that. I mean, it's one thing to train somebody in a simulated situation, and we do have now our examinations are based on simulations where we have actors that come in, and the medical students are presented with scenarios, and they have to deal with those patients, you know, those actors as if they are true patients. That's a good way of assessing the individuals, but there is no way to completely make it realistic. I mean, the first time you have to deliver bad news to a family, you'll never forget that.
What was your first time?
My first time was a patient who had a heart attack, a massive heart attack, and had a cardiac arrest. And I remember I was on call and was brought into the hospital, was on a ventilator, was on life support basically, and the chances of them surviving without surgery was 0, and the chances of them surviving with surgery was about 5%, 5 to 10%. And I remember it was a relatively young patient, and you know, I thought, I wasn't sure whether or not to go ahead with the surgery, because the last thing you want to be is the executioner. And you know that there's about a 90 to 95% chance that patient's not going to survive. But you go ahead because you want to be able to offer that family and that patient some hope, because miracles do happen. Sometimes, you know, good things do happen.
You didn't throw up your hands and say,
no, no.
You have no chance.
No, I didn't do that. Whether or not that was the right thing or wrong thing to do is, you know,
those are the kind of decisions that you have to make.
Yeah, and sometimes they're very difficult decisions, because sometimes you do have to say no. Sometimes the risk of the operation does outweigh the potential benefits, and you have to say, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do, because I don't think I'll be able to get you off the table. So sometimes you do have to say no, and that's difficult too. Knowing when to say no is a lot more difficult than knowing when to say yes.
The thing about saying no, we know about placebo effect, but there's opposite of placebo effect. Giving someone no hope can be an anti-placebo effect. Did you ever think of that?
Sure, Sure, absolutely.
Because miracles do happen, and
yeah.
unpredictable things do happen.
Well, we try not to present it as no hope. I mean, we try to tell them that we don't think that surgery is going to be beneficial, and if anything, surgery may be detrimental. So that there is some hope, but there is hope with other types of procedures.
I think you're doing something that is so difficult and in such a humanitarian way. The fact that you, because with your experience, you focus on that, on how to make it humane and how to be as compassionate as you can possibly be, makes you very, very special. And also the fact that you have to keep, and you are innovative and keeping informed with the latest techniques on top of, how long do you work? How many hours a week?
Oh, probably about anywhere from 60, 70 hours a week.
Stay healthy.
Thank you.
And all the best. And remember to be a mensch. Stay with us for Nicholas Maes, author of a young adult book that has never been written before. Avi Greenbaum, 15, is Jewish and lives in West Jerusalem. Musa Shakir is also 15. He's Palestinian and lives in East Jerusalem. Both are the youngest of 3 children, and both have absent fathers. Avi's father they all made Aliyah from Canada 5 years prior to in this story, but he can't hack Israel, so he commutes back and forth. Musa's father is in jail for attempted terrorism. They belong to the same soccer club, they've even played together, but they are oblivious of each other as though they lived in 2 different countries, oceans apart. I'm reading an excerpt from a remarkable novel geared to young adults called Crescent Star, and the author is with us today, Nicholas Maes. Welcome.
Hi. Many thanks for having me on the show.
This is a remarkable book.
Thank you.
And no one has ever written about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, relationships, through the eyes of 2 boys. Nobody's ever done that before for young adults.
Not that I'm aware of. There was The Shepherd's Granddaughter
which
that
got
appeared.
bad press because it was so...
Depending on what side you champion, some people thought that it was really remarkable, and other people,
But this is very even-handed. You try to present both boys' worlds as accurately as possible.
Yes, to the extent that it was possible. I'm quite familiar with Israel. I lived there for approximately 2 years. I'm much more familiar with the Jewish side of life in Israel than I am with the Palestinian one. But you're there for a period of time.
But you
read the
made that
papers, you walk
Palestinian
around.
boy's life extremely real. Even visits to the prison,
Right, sure.
you wrote about.
Yes, yes.
And the impact on the kids.
Right.
His older brother had to run that store in the shuk. All the other ramifications of living with an absent father, including both those boys are getting pressured to be militant, to be soldiers.
Right.
And both don't really want to.
Yes. I want my readers to understand the political pressures that are placed upon these characters, but political pressures within a narrative context, a good story, but a story that's really going to reflect the nature of life in Israel and the stakes at large, and how individuals have to decide, whether they're going to live up to the standard that's set for them by the people surrounding them or not. And in the end, I think when people read Crescent Star, I want them to read a good story. And when I say people, I mean, I suppose young, teenagers between the ages of, let's say, 14 and 17.
I'm holding it up for everyone to see.
I want them to read the story. I want them to enjoy the story. But at the same time, I want them to understand what's at stake. I want them to understand the political foundations that have been put in place. I want them to understand the motivations that people bring to the plate. And I don't want them thinking at every turn, I'm championing this side as opposed to that side. Those guys are the good guys and those guys are the bad guys. Obviously, being Jewish, I believe in the Jewish state. I'm a Zionist. But at the same time, I understand this is a...
But it's very even-handed.
Yeah, it has to be.
Are you getting criticized for that?
I don't think so. I don't think so. In fact, I would say that the even-handedness, just from a point of view of selling points, is probably a bad thing rather than a good thing. in the sense that if I'd written something that was really almost vitriolically anti-Zionist, I think people would have come and they would have said either this is great because he is a champion for justice, or people would have been saying, we really don't like what you're saying, but they would be writing about it nonetheless.
But are people saying you're too sympathetic to
No,
the
I don't think so.
Palestinians?
No, I think the people who have read it, I think commentators who read it feel that it is even-handed, and I think they feel that this is something of a breath of fresh air. But again, when you take extreme positions, very often you're in a sense selling something, because many people, I think, come to the issue where they do want to be pumped up, where they do want to come away feeling strongly in support of one
They
side
want
or the
black
other.
and whiteness. They want the
they
good
do,
guy
they
and
do.
the bad guy.
They do, and I think that's what made the writing of this novel so difficult. The fact that you really want to, without becoming really, overly sentimental. We're all alike. We're all human beings. Why can't we get along? That type of attitude does not get to the heart of the matter here. Without going down that path, you do want to keep in your mind and in your reader's mind the fact that each time you're describing a character, this is someone who is a flesh and blood creature. Within your imagination at least, he does have certain expectations of the world, and you really are rooting for both of these people. You're rooting for Avi and you're rooting for Musa. Although you understand, life in Israel makes things so difficult at times that if you were a member of one party or the other, you would have to make up your mind. And that's very, very difficult. And that's why I think for so long this debate has gone on, and people have decided, I'm going to throw my hat into one arena as opposed to the other, because they don't want to see the complexities involved. So this really leads to cognitive dissonance. Just as you're thinking, okay, I'm going to root for this side, something comes up and makes you think, no, maybe this side is the other one, or this side, or this side. And at the end of the novel, you really don't know what to think. But I think you understand just how tense, how complex, how riveting, how dividing this political landscape is. And I think that's what makes it perhaps more of a realistic commentary within narrative form, of course, with fictional characters, than a book which decides I'm going to champion one side overtly over the other. The danger here is that you could be writing in a vein whereby everything is sort of equal, that one side is equal to the other, a morally relativistic universe, and I think that's very dangerous. I mean, I told myself when I wrote this book, I could not under any set of circumstances give any type of credence to the suicide bomber. I think that type of action is just morally repugnant.
But you humanize the suicide bomber. You humanize the father. You make us understand why he's driven. You make him.
Well, actually, he is allegedly involved in a plot. It seems that he was responsible for importing explosives through this little export-import business that he has. Some explosives were found in his dry goods. Was he coerced into doing this? Was he doing it willingly? We're not really sure. He himself takes some responsibility for it, but it's not as though. And on the sides, of course, there is discussion of violence taking place in Iraq, violence taking place, in other parts of Israel, and the commentary. Some characters feel, well, yeah, it's terrible, but they had it coming, and then Musa himself feels, I'm not sure if this is the way we want to go, so that
Musa feels like he's trapped. Musa, I get a feeling of hopelessness from him. He's trapped by poverty because they're barely making a living through this store.
He's doing okay. He's surrounded by it. He's a good student. He's making a good living, but I think he understands that now that he's reached the age of 15, there is this adult realm that he's going to have to wander into, and that when people become.
And if he doesn't go that way, he separates himself from his family.
Yes, it's true, and I think that that's probably a fairly realistic description of, the Palestinian situation, perhaps to a greater degree than it is true of Israel, where the political spectrum is much broader, and it would be possible.
And criticism and dissent.
Yes, I think that's
is
true,
allowed.
but even so, the general expectation is you're going to serve in the army. Avi is becoming aware of this, and when push comes to shove, you're going to have you're going to have your mates around you, and you're going to have to do what men do. Something of a catchphrase that runs through the novel. This is a very, very hard environment where your own inclinations are not always going to be ones that you yourself can act on. You are going to be very much a product of the politics around you, the attitudes around you, the friendships around you, and you're not going to want to betray these. That's true of any society, of course, but everything, when you travel to Israel, you realize everything in Israel is much more pointed and much more in your face, and therefore these decisions.
But Avi has a way out, because his father, who you made Canadian,
Yes,
the family,
yes,
commutes. As you put it, he can't hack Israel.
yes,
So he commutes.
yes.
And he goes back and forth. If Avi wanted to, he could go to Toronto
He
and
could.
live there with his father.
He
couldn't
could, he could. I think that's true of any Israeli. Any Israeli, I mean, think how many Israelis live here in Toronto itself. Any Israeli could do that. But I think I work with Israelis in the high school that I teach at here. I think many of them who have set up shop for themselves here, they miss Israel desperately. And I don't think they labor under any sense of guilt, but I do think at times that they feel what's happening there is still very much a part of them. And I think many of them feel that in a sense they're experiencing all of this tension or all of this joy at second hand, and I think it does bother them at times. So I think Avi's condition is very much like any Israeli's condition, but you're right, he could opt out if he wanted to.
But Musa can't. Where is he going to go?
Well, his brother, interestingly enough, lives in Canada too. Remember, and
Yeah, I forgot
and
that.
it's
So he could theoretically get out
he
too.
could in principle. There is a fairly large diaspora Palestinian population, so in principle he could do that. But I think both kids understand that this is a problem that isn't going to go away, even if they move away from it. Their own intense emotional involvement will not necessarily, they could escape that, but it's still going to dog them at every turn. That's part of what it is to be, associated with this endless tension between these two populations.
Why did you write this book and gear it to teenagers? It's really a teenager's book, although if anyone wants a synopsis of the history of Israel, and the history of the conflict, in 1 hour you can get it from here.
Yeah.
But why young adults? Why didn't you write an adult book?
Several reasons. Number one, why fiction rather than nonfiction?
And why fiction?
Although, I mean, I can't.
Although you make it come alive through fiction.
Right,
in a
right,
way,
exactly.
I understand that.
In fact, my own training is classics, so I am trained as an academic and principal, but I've always wanted to write fiction. And in a sense, I think fiction, to a very great degree, describes the world much more powerfully than nonfiction does. And not only that, it involves people to a much greater degree as well. When you look at our engagement with the past, be it Napoleonic France or ancient Greece or ancient Rome, very often we're doing it through a fictional vehicle which has a strong historical component, rather than through Grote's monumental history of Rome, or some scholars' monumental history of Napoleonic France, and therefore I thought fiction is probably the right vehicle in general when I approach when I engage the world.
Teenagers? Why gear
Why
it to
teenagers? This is a problem that's not going to go away. This is a problem that people are obsessed with. I mean, commentators are obsessed with this. Sometimes Israel is in the news, sometimes it isn't, but it always comes back. It always comes back. This is something that is really going to preoccupy audiences internationally for a long time to come, I feel. And I think it really is the inflection point to some degree between Western attitudes and non-Western attitudes, and therefore there's sort of the Judeo-Christian tradition versus the non-Judeo-Christian tradition. There's a lot riding on this conflict. I think this is why it is so. It really takes up a great deal of space when people read the paper, when they look at the news, and I'm not really satisfied with the commentary that takes place, because too often within the space of a 5-minute story on the CBC or NPR or Fox News or any of these channels, all of whom bring, of course, their own modified ideological take on the situation to the table. I'm not satisfied because in the end, just think of it, within 5 minutes, what can you do? I mean, in the end, I think you're really, the way you push the story forward is by deciding in advance what side do I want the audience to root for. You can't really just give objective fact because it's just being thrown out there without any context whatsoever. So I'm not really satisfied with the commentary that takes place. And in the end, I think to some degree, adults have to look after their own interest in the context.
Hold on, and we'll be back after this break. We're back, and we're talking with Nicholas Maes, the author of Crescent Star, a book about the Palestinian-Israel conflict written for teenagers.
That's right. So I think I was just telling you why I wrote it for teenagers, just wrapping up that point quickly. They are the future consumers of this story, which, as I said, is not going to go away. And I think I would like them to have some type of even-handed basis that they could work from when they are actually going to absorb these images, interpret these images, and try and understand the situation. It's not going to help them if all they really know
are the newspapers.
Are the newspapers and scenes of the Shabib throwing stones at Israeli soldiers, or if they just see a death count. That really isn't going to help them. To this day, I think if you were to ask the average Canadian after years and years and years of broadcasts, what are the borders of Israel? How many Israelis do you have living within Israel? How many Jews? Versus how many Israeli Arabs? What are the surrounding countries? When were these wars fought? What were the circumstances? They would have no idea because the context has never been provided. And therefore, I would like the next consumer of this story, if I can put it that way, to come to the table with a more even-handed approach, greater curiosity, and more balance, if possible.
Nick, you have written this book when the tactics were violence with the anti-Israel forces, the Palestinians in particular, when terrorism took the form of suicide bombers and snipers and attacks against civilians. But they're changing their strategy. They're changing it to follow the Arab Spring demonstrations when you don't need guns, all you need is a cell phone. This massing and this massive infiltration on the Syrian border that just took place is another paradigm, totally.
Yes. I think that that's a very temporary tactic. I think that I'm not an expert on these things at all.
What's your opinion?
I just think that this is a way of a very cynical government in Syria distracting the media's attention from its own self-made problems. And trying to do what I think a number of regimes have tried to do, try to somehow shove the blame onto Israel and its response to populations that pose a tangible security threat, certainly in its mind. And therefore, I think that this is a tactic.
Do you think this tactic is going to catch on?
I don't.
This non-violent.
Well, I don't think of it as non-violent because I think when people are actually coming to your border and they're cutting the wire and they're coming across your territory, that is not non-violent. I think that under a very broad interpretation.
And I'm quoting Gabi Ben-Dor from the University of Haifa, that is this expert in security. What if 200,000 Arabs want to come to Israel to pray? To pray. I'm coming to pray. I have no guns. I'm not going to be violent.
I think. Look, when we look back on President Obama's remarks from 2 weeks ago, he was stating that negotiations would have to be set about the understanding of 1967 borders. I think probably that will be the case one way or another, but you have to be very, very clear on what Israel gets in return for that. And I think one of the things that it gets in return is an end to this idea of the law of return for Palestinians. It's just, I don't think it's going to happen. I really don't think it's going to happen. In other words, you cannot have large numbers of people who are not part of the Israeli state coming in and reclaiming their land. It will be tragic. It will unquestionably be tragic for this population, but if there's going to be a settled conclusion to these tensions...
What about the mass nonviolent protests?
It depends on what form that they've taken. I think one of the reasons why we've seen so many people killed over the last 20 years is that these protests have not been peaceful. These protests usually have involved throwing stones at soldiers or having armed men operating within their midst. When young men are being buried and you have these large funerals.
If 200,000 Arabs say, we're just coming to pray in Jerusalem, it's our holy place too.
I don't think it could happen purely because they would have to come into the country in some form or another. And I think if they're not going to storm the borders. I think we've seen this is one reason why I think the Israeli response has been so very tough. And I don't think they're going to get on planes. I don't think they're going to get on trains. They're not going to drive their cars. I think that this is something that isn't going to happen. I think the much more interesting development is this burgeoning of democracy in the area, and that is a mixed kettle of fish. It could work out extraordinarily well. It might lead to other elements coming onto the table that will make life very, very difficult for all parties involved.
Like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
Possibly. It depends. I mean, it could be that the Muslim Brotherhood decide that it's to their own interest and to the greater interest of the Egyptian population that they become, something of a democratic state. It could be that there's the people who are trying to get rid of Assad will figure that perhaps they really are genuinely better off with some type of democratic system in place once again. Could be true of other nations as well that are surrounded, that are experiencing this cataclysm of political protest in the streets. The irony here, I think the irony here is that if any of these democratic protests are really going to turn into genuine opportunities for populations in the area, these people will want to follow the example of Israel. And by that I mean, I think they'll have to have a free, open society. If they want, for example, if you take a look at a country like Egypt, where you have tourism and the Suez Canal as the essential sources of revenue for them, I think in order to actually make life sustainable for 80 million people, you probably would have to develop the type of expertise that Israel has been so effective at in recent years. You'll have to have excellent universities, allowing people to study a wide range of subjects. You'll have to get used to protests, nonviolent ones against one administration or another. You would have to have freedom of assembly. You would have to have all of this stuff. Otherwise, I think this stuff just dies on the table. And you have a very different type of attitude coming into place, one quite similar to Mubarak, or possibly even worse. Remember, before all of this broke out, Mubarak was looked upon by the Western media as a moderate. That was the adjective that was applied to him time and time again. And it was only as this critical mass developed that people were willing to call him by a very different name.
All these seismic changes that are taking place, are you going to are you going to incorporate that?
Possibly. I don't always like writing about politics. Israel is
What's your next book?
It's a real fantasy. It's again a young adult novel called Transmigration, and it's based on exactly that. These characters who are actually able to take their souls and place them in animals and so on and so forth. It's a complex but very
like science fiction?
Yes, sort of. I wrote another science fiction tale called Laughing Wolf, which was taking place in the distant future and involved a character returning to the Roman past, which I'm quite well acquainted with, because he had to get hold of something that was going to help the people out in his own day and age. So I'm used to writing on a wide array of topics.
How much does your background, your academic background, inform your life and your work? I think you're the only person I know of your age group that took a PhD in classics.
Yeah.
Ancient history, Greek,
yes,
Roman.
Classics is the foundation
Are
of
we
Western
seeing
culture.
that nothing is new under the sun, for instance?
In some ways, yes.
Is there a repetition of history?
There is. I think we are in a very different world because technology just is really transforming human relations. But the underpinnings, the rock hard foundations, I think you could find a lot of our own suppositions about the world in Thucydides, Herodotus, Plato, and other such characters. Modified, of course, by 2,000 years of commentary, but a lot of it is there. And the beauty of classics is that when you actually do study it in detail, it is a remarkable foundation for an understanding of Western culture, a remarkable one. And, you know, once you've studied Plato and Herodotus and Homer and Virgil, etc., it just opens up your eyes to the way the world developed, you know, to 19th century England, you know, 16th century Italy, the Renaissance, the Reformation. You understand what the stakes are to a very great degree. You understand.
But all those great civilizations rose and died.
Well, that too is very much a product of classical thinking, especially the Greek point of view, the tragic point of view, that these things do come to an end, and that people very often hasten them on by their own inclinations.
Are we hastening it?
That's a topic for a different matter. But yes, I think in the West, I think it will be more difficult over the next 100 years.
Are we looking at the decline of the West?
Possibly. I think
and the rise of the East?
Possibly, but I don't think the East will rise necessarily in the form that it exists in at present, and I don't think the West will necessarily die. I think it will just lose.
Decline in power.
Yes, I think so. Decline in power, reach, influence, richness, and it is very sad. It is very sad.
It's happening? Would you say?
In some ways, yes. I think it's too easy to play the prophet of doom and sound the note of apocalypse. You know, witness the end of the world that was supposed to take place 2 weeks ago. You know, it didn't happen, at least as far as I know. But I think that we are living at a stage where people probably have even less investment in the past than they did 20 years ago, 30 years ago when I was growing up. The idea of the past, the idea of any type of influence or any type of meaningful commentary that the 19th century, the 18th century, or 4th century Athens could actually have on day-to-day events now is minimal. We don't really respect the past. We're not interested in the past. And I think that's quite dangerous, because our values of progress for handedness...
I'm thinking of food and water, for instance. The Roman Empire went down because it couldn't feed its armies all over the world.
Rome went down, I think, for...
One of the reasons.
Possibly. There are many, many different reasons. I think Rome probably collapsed because people stopped believing in Rome. Its own citizens no longer believed in Rome. They were no longer willing to do the heavy lifting necessary to carry Rome on to the next stage. And I think that that's true.
You're talking about patriotism?
Patriotism, just values. Really, in the end, I would say what fascinates me is that civilization is remarkably ordered, and in becoming remarkably ordered, it causes, in a sense, a softening of perspective on the part of its population. Not that they grow soft, but their own position, their own interpretation of the world becomes much more humanistic, which is wonderful. It's just that it leaves you open to doubts about the soundness of your own condition, and it leads you open to doubts about how far you can go in ensuring that this system continues for the next generation, especially if it means cracking heads or behaving in a way that's quite violent at times and quite forceful.
Is it an analogy to ancient times in the fact that people are not respecting their leaders? They are disrespecting. They're cynical about their leaders. Or was that always the case? Or is it more so?
It's not the leaders, I think. It's not the leaders so much as it is the actual set of traditional Western values. I think that ultimately will determine whether the West continues or not. Western values, not only ones which you clearly see in operation nowadays, wonderful values. Open-mindedness, acceptance of minorities, etc., but other values too. That
lacks the passion of, for instance, Islam.
Yes, it does.
There's no match.
It does. Yes, it does.
We don't have an ideology that we would die for. We don't have principles that we die for.
You have to have values. You have to have values that would put you in a position where you would have to, at times, bring violence into the field in order to continue these values. And that is very, very problematic. It's very problematic. I myself am a product of how tough am I? How willing am I to crack heads? How willing am I to push forward so that the next generation has the same disposition, emotional, cultural, and moral, and so on and so forth, as I myself have.
It's happening all over the West, that we lack the passion of our values.
Yes,
that we lack
absolutely.
the will.
Yes.
To stand up and fight.
Patriotism
used to be a given. my flag, my country.
I'm not asking, I don't know if I could ask people to be blindly patriotic, but I think it is fair to look at reformers, people who are, you know, savagely reforming. That is to say, they really feel that the West has lost it, and that they feel that, you know, in a sense, the moral impetus is to be found in other parts of the world, non-Western parts of the world. I think that if you do believe in a world where, you know, if you do believe in secularism and secular values, if you believe that, you know, women should have rights, if you believe that minorities should have rights, that there should be freedom of speech, there should be a separation of church or mosque or synagogue and state, etc., etc., it is the West that is the engine of this perspective. It is the West that is the engine of this perspective. And therefore, if you're operating within the West, and you want to see other parts of the world progress in the way that the West has progressed over the last 4 or 5 centuries, you have to understand that if you actually, you know, weaken the focal point of the West, the pivot point of the West, you really weaken the possibility of extending prosperity and generosity and stability and affluence to a much larger part of the world, because it will come from us. I mean, that sounds culturally arrogant, but I don't mean it that way. I mean to share our riches with as many populations as possible, and I think we are the engine of that growth. And if you sabotage that engine or weaken that engine, you will not see these different values accepted by foreign populations, which would be tragic, I think. Truly tragic.
Thank you, Nick.
You're more than welcome.
We'll be back next week. In the meantime, remember to be a mensch.